historical Western economic growth was institutional ingenuity. Basically, it wasn't resources and it wasn't even production, it was getting the institutions right. Democratic process, very, very liberal perspective on this. Democratic process, judicial systems, control of elites, which is something I hadn't quite thought about before I read his work. Formalized tenure systems, transparent governance, etc. And as they put those institutions in place, suddenly the possibilities of economic growth were enhanced. So I ask myself, and I suggest you ask yourselves, should the development process, the development industry, invest in institutional change and good governance? Would this help mitigate the inability of some countries to profit from their own intrinsic advantages? That is to say, each country has got certain capabilities and advantages, but if the institutions aren't right, they will likely be thwarted. And what are these institutional predicaments? Well, I've been working in Kenya. I love Kenya. I love the Kenyans. It has dropped to one of, I think, one of the 3 most corrupt countries in the world. So when I think about development, I think continuously about the Kenyan experience, which of course isn't just Kenya alone. It covers many different countries. And here are a few of the predicaments that Kenya has experienced and many other countries. Over-centralization of decision-making, where there's a few people making decisions for the many. Rent-seeking. That's an economic term. Does everybody know what rent-seeking is? If you occupy, let's say you're in a football game, somebody has to go through your little gate before they can get in. So they have to give you a ticket, right? So that's the whole principle. They have to have bought that ticket. What if, to let them in, you also say, well, yes, you have your ticket, but I want $5. That's rent-seeking. In short, they occupy a funnel position in which people must pass, but to do so, they have to pay something. And then multiply that by many, many times over. The police who basically are on the roads watching the cars go by and put up roadblocks. People who have the little booths when you get a license. People, anytime you see a line, that's an opportunity for rent-seeking. That is to say, the multiplication of rent-seeking positions means that you've enhanced or increased the possibility of corruption in key places. Unstable property systems and insecurity. I am not actually an advocate for wholesale privatization. I can give a whole talk on that. But having some sort of stability in the property system is very important. And to render it unstable, which very often privatization processes do, means that the whole climate for investment and for making basically long-term decisions is undermined. Weak or politicized legal systems. I'm afraid in Kenya everything is politicized, and the courts are as well, including bribery. There's a measure, which is the number of steps it takes to open a business, but you can also say the number of steps to get a license, or the number of steps to resolve any problem, get information. If you have a system that's both complex and hostile, obviously this is going to inhibit any development process. And of course, inefficiency and entrenched interests. So these are not uncommon situations. They can be overcome, and the way to overcome them are basically institutional. So I'm going to give you a few examples. I'm going to talk a little bit about Eastern Africa. I was just there, and they're quite interesting. How many people have been to Africa? Okay, quite a few. This is the difference. When I was a student, everybody wanted to go somewhere, but almost nobody had been anywhere. And now today, everybody's been many places. And I think the advantage you all have in terms of experience is extraordinary. So when you're studying something, you've already had a taste for it. You know something about the conditions on the ground. So I wanted to talk a little bit about East Africa, just because, Eastern Africa, because I want to include Ethiopia, just because that's the area that I know something about, and I can perhaps contribute to the discussion. So the question in my mind, is devolution the answer? If you have highly centralized governance, that's the opposite of devolution. Devolution means you take powers at the center, and basically you push them down the hierarchy towards the community level. Now, it may be at the level of a province, it may be at the level of a state, maybe at the level of a district. And in fact, the best systems probably will allocate powers at those different levels insofar as it's most effective. That's the principle of subsidiarity, which is a funny word, but I think it's a good word. A subsidiary means things subside to the level at which it's most effective. Decisions should be made at the level where they most matter and where the right information exists. So if you find somebody's making a decision with regard to your lives who doesn't really know the conditions of your life, you'd say, why don't they talk to me? Because I both will feel the impact of the decision and I know the conditions under which the decision will have effect. And subsidiarity means that you adjust your system of governance such that decisions are being made and powers occur at the level in which they are most effectively linked to the populations in question. Now, why is this an issue? Well, in many of the countries I'm just going to mention, ethnic diversity often leads certain regions to feel a high degree of autonomy. They're wary of their neighbors. This is the place they live. They know one another. And therefore, to see powers centralized is in effect to think of your own region as being disempowered. And in these countries, historically, centralized powers tend to be held by not just an abstract government, which we might say would be like Ottawa or Washington, which represents everybody, and you have a process where it's a representative government, but it tends to be held by one group representing one region who has seized power, and therefore, to that extent, is seen as illegitimate. So let me mention Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Kenya. Just a few ideas, and I'm going to hope to spend most time on Kenya. Ethiopia is a fascinating country, and I wanted to mention it because I have to travel there next week for a major conference, and I'm really looking forward to it because Ethiopia is probably the most fascinating country in Africa. It's also one of the poorest. It was autonomous. It was almost never colonized. For a few years before the beginning of the First World War, the Ethiopians colonized it. Basically, it was independent throughout. And it was ruled by the Abyssinian dynasty. Haile Selassie's a name I'm sure that's familiar to you. It was overthrown by the socialist Derg, which then ruled, but they had to deal with a couple of secessionist movements, in particular the Eritreans and the Tigrayans. Well, conflict disrupted the economy. Interestingly, the development agencies and the international community tended to say that the problems of the economy, and in particular the famines that occurred, resulted from ecological and environmental issues, which seemed to me to be sort of taking an issue that was highly political and giving it a sort of well, call it a greenwash or a brownwash because of the dust, saying this is environmental, it's not political, when in fact it had to do with this fundamental issue of conflict that's disrupted Ethiopia for several decades. The TPLF, the Tigrayan Liberation Front, defeated the Derg, and their partners, the Eritreans, had a vote, and they voted for secession. And now we have two countries. The Tigrayans are independent. The Tigrayan-led government under President Zenawi, who's there now, established very courageous,